For almost 2,000 years, the Gospel of John has been one of the most powerful books ever written. Its words have shaped empires, they've inspired incredible art, and they've defined faith for billions of people. But behind all those profound verses, there's a historical cold case. Who in the world actually wrote it? So let's dive into this detective story and see what the evidence really tells us about the author of this ancient masterpiece. For centuries, the answer seemed pretty straightforward. The author was John, the son of Zebedee. He was a young fisherman from Galilee who, along with his brother James, was one of the very first disciples Jesus called. The tradition says he was an eyewitness to all of it, the youngest of the 12 apostles, and, this is key, the one uniquely called the disciple whom Jesus loved.
And church tradition paints this really vivid picture of him. He apparently started out as this fiery, ambitious young guy, even nicknamed a son of thunder by Jesus himself. But he totally transformed, living to a ripe old age in the city of Ephesus. As an old man, they say he was so focused on just one message that his disciples would ask him, "Why do you only ever say, 'Little children, love one another'?" And his reply was so simple, "Because it is the Lord's commandment, and if it alone is kept, it is sufficient." For him, that one command was literally everything.
It's a really powerful personal story, right? But here's the twist, the thing that launches our whole investigation. The vast majority of modern biblical scholars believe that John the Apostle probably wrote none of it. Not the Gospel, not the letters, and not the book of Revelation.
Now, this isn't some brand new idea. For centuries, scholars have been piecing together clues from the language, from history, and from the text itself that make the traditional story, well, a lot more complicated. So let's put on our detective hats and take a hard look at the evidence they've found.
So the case against John the Apostle really starts with some practical, real-world problems. First up, the language. The Gospel of John is written in this really sophisticated, flowing Greek. But John the Apostle, he was a fisherman from Galilee. His native language would have been Aramaic. In fact, the book of Acts flat out describes him as a grammatos, a Greek word that basically means unlettered or illiterate. Then there's the geography. The author knows Jerusalem and Judea with stunning, almost photographic precision, while the Apostle John was from way up north in Galilee. And maybe the biggest clue of all, the author never once says, "Hey, I'm John, son of Zebedee, and I wrote this." The whole work is completely anonymous.
So, how did we even get this tradition in the first place? Well, take a look at this timeline. The Gospel was written anonymously, sometime around 90 to 100 AD, but the very first person to explicitly name John the Apostle as the author was a church father named Irenaeus, and that wasn't until 180 AD. That's a gap of about 80 years, and almost as soon as the tradition started, the debate began. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, you had major church figures like Dionysius and Eusebius already questioning if one guy could have possibly written all these very different works.
Okay, so if the external history is a little murky, let's turn to the text itself. Because the Gospel of John has its own set of fascinating and sometimes contradictory clues about where it came from. It's this wild mix of the highly spiritual and the surprisingly down-to-earth.
Now, the author does give us one big clue. He claims the entire story is based on the testimony of this really mysterious figure, the unnamed disciple whom Jesus loved. But honestly, this just makes the mystery even deeper. Who exactly was this person?
And that right there is the central puzzle. Tradition says, of course, it's John the Apostle, but scholars have thrown out a bunch of other ideas. Could it be Lazarus? The Gospel explicitly says Jesus loved him. Some early texts outside the Bible, the Gnostic Gospels, even suggest it was Mary Magdalene. Others argue maybe it wasn't a real person at all, but a symbolic figure representing the ideal Christian. The identity of the Gospel's star witness is a mystery wrapped inside another mystery.
So far, the Gospel feels really theological, right? It's almost floating above the gritty details of history. But just when you think it's purely symbolic, archaeology comes along and pulls us right back down to earth with a thud.
This part is just stunning. The Gospel of John, the one that's often dismissed as the least historical, actually has more specific, archaeologically verified details about first-century Jerusalem than any other gospel. That pool of Bethesda, with its 5 porticos, people used to think it was a literary invention. But nope, archaeological discoveries match the description. The Pool of Siloam, a key site in one of the healing stories, was literally unearthed in 2004. Even tiny details about the crucifixion, like the practice of leg breaking, are backed up by the discovery of the remains of a crucified man from that exact time and place. Somebody behind this gospel knew first-century Jerusalem inside and out.
Okay, so we have a text that is both highly theological and grounded in very specific historical detail. But the plot thickens when we turn to the other major book that's attributed to John, Revelation. Was this crazy apocalyptic vision written by the same person who wrote the Gospel? Well, the linguistic evidence suggests a pretty firm no.
Yeah, the difference in the Greek is like night and day. As Bishop Dionysius noted way back in the 3rd century, the Gospel is written with remarkable skill. In contrast, the book of Revelation is just filled with what modern scholar Bart Ehrman calls grammatical errors and stylistic abnormalities. Its Greek is awkward, it feels clunky, suggesting the author wasn't a native speaker. The literary fingerprints just do not match.
And this table perfectly illustrates how the Gospel of John was first received. It shows how often very early church writers quoted the Gospels. So check out Justin Martyr in the mid-2nd century. He references the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, over 170 times, and John, just once, a single time. This really suggests that in the early days, John's Gospel had a much more, let's say, ambivalent, maybe even controversial status compared to the others.
Okay, our investigation is getting close to the end. We've looked at the testimony, the internal clues, the archaeology, the linguistic evidence. It's time to bring in the final lineup of suspects for who really wrote all these Johannine works.
So let's run through the final lineup. Suspect number 1, John the Apostle, the traditional eyewitness. Suspect 2, John the Elder, this kind of obscure figure from Ephesus that some early historians talked about. Then there's John of Patmos, who our linguistic evidence points to as the author of Revelation, but only Revelation. After that, we have the beloved disciple himself, an unknown but real eyewitness whose testimony might be the core of the gospel. And finally, there's the Johannine community, the idea that this wasn't one author at all, but a whole school of writers and editors who shaped these texts over many years.
So what's the verdict? Well, the truth is, there is no single easy answer. This isn't a mystery novel where the detective gathers everyone in the library for a big reveal. The evidence is complex, and it points in a bunch of different directions all at once. The author could be one of our suspects, it could be a combination of them, or it could be someone whose name is just completely lost to history. After 2,000 years, the mystery of who John really was endures.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty provocative thought. For a collection of writings that has profoundly shaped history, faith, and culture for 2 millennia, does its power and its meaning ultimately depend on knowing the name of the person who held the pen?